The rain came down like God's own fury, hammering the cracked asphalt of Route 9 until the road itself seemed to scream. Lightning split the bruised sky, turning everything white for half a heartbeat before thunder rolled across the empty stretch of highway like distant artillery. David Miller's hands tightened on the steering wheel of his battered Ford pickup. The kind of grip that came from years of working metal and machinery, from knowing that some things you held on to and some things you let slip through your fingers, no matter how hard you fought. The dashboard clock glowed green in the storm's darkness. 8:47 a.m. 13 minutes. That was all the time standing between him and the interview at Anderson Technologies, the one chance he'd spent 3 months preparing for the job that could pull him and Emma out of the hole they'd been sinking into since Sarah died. His resume sat on the passenger seat, protected in a plastic sleeve he'd bought specifically for today, the edges already curling from the humidity that seeped through every crack in the truck's weathered frame. David's foot pressed harder on the accelerator. The engine rattled in protest, that familiar knock that meant the timing belt was going another repair. He couldn't afford another problem stacking on top of all the others like a tower built from overdue notices and broken promises. The speedometer needle climbed past 60, pushing into territory where the old Ford started to shake, where the bald front tire began to shimmy in a way that made his mechanic's instincts scream warnings he was choosing to ignore. Have you ever had to choose between saving yourself or helping a stranger? In that moment, David had $52, 13 minutes, and one impossible choice. The wallet in his back pocket felt thin as paper, and he knew without checking what was inside. 2 20s, 110, 2 1s, $52. That was everything standing between him and the eviction notice taped to his apartment door, between Emma's inhaler prescription and another trip to the emergency room where they'd treat her for free, but look at him like he was failing at the only job that mattered. The Anderson Technologies position paid $48,000 a year, benefits included enough to stop the bleeding, enough to maybe finally start building something that looked like a future instead of just surviving one day at a time. The storm intensified, rain coming sideways, now sheets of water obscuring everything beyond the hood of the truck. David leaned forward, squinting through the windshield where the wipers scraped back and forth in a losing battle against the deluge. He shouldn't be driving this fast in these conditions, shouldn't be pushing an old truck with bad tires and worse brakes. But the clock didn't care about should or shouldn't. The clock just kept counting down. 8:48. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. Emma's ringtone, the one she'd programmed herself with some pop song he didn't recognize. David's hand moved toward it automatically before he remembered no distractions. Not now, not when he was this close. She was safe with Dorothy Harris, their neighbor, the 72-year-old woman who'd been Sarah's best friend and had appointed herself Emma's surrogate grandmother in the 3 years since the funeral. Dorothy would have already walked Emma to the bus stop, would have made sure she had her inhaler, would have done all the things a father should do, but couldn't, because he had to be here driving through a storm, chasing a job that might save them both. The phone stopped buzzing. Voicemail. He'd call her back after the interview, tell her how it went, maybe even take her out for ice cream if he felt confident enough about his performance. The thought brought a bitter smile to his face. Ice cream. Like that was something they could afford even on a good day. Like he had any business thinking about celebrations when he hadn't even walked through Anderson Technologies' doors yet. Movement caught his eye, something dark against the gray curtain of rain. David's foot eased off the accelerator, instinct overriding urgency, as the shape resolved into a sedan, black and sleek, tilted at an angle that meant trouble. One wheel buried deep in the mud where the shoulder gave way to a drainage ditch, the whole vehicle listing like a ship taking on water. The driver's door stood open and a figure stumbled out into the storm, a woman in a gray coat that was already soaked through her heels, sinking into the muck with every desperate step. David's hands moved before his brain could catch up, pulling the truck to the side of the road, the brake pedal going nearly to the floor before the vehicle finally stopped. His eyes found the clock, 8:49. 11 minutes. The interview was 20 minutes away under normal conditions, and these weren't normal conditions, and stopping meant arriving late. And arriving late meant losing the job before he even had a chance to explain why a mechanic with a military background and a spotty work history deserved a shot at senior logistics analyst. But the woman was trying to climb back into her car, one hand gripping the door frame while her feet scrambled for purchase in the mud, and David could see the panic in the way she moved, could recognize the specific terror of being trapped and helpless. Because he'd lived in that space for 3 years, ever since the oncologist had sat them down and explained that Sarah's cancer was stage 4, and the treatments would buy time, but not a cure. His hand reached for the door handle. His father's voice echoed in his head, the old Marine drill instructor who'd raised him on discipline and duty. You don't walk past someone who needs help. You don't look away because it's inconvenient. That's not how we do things, son. 3 years dead from a heart attack, never got to meet Emma. Never knew his son had learned the lesson so well, it would cost him everything. David stepped out into the rain. The cold hit him like a physical blow, water instantly soaking through his white button-down shirt. The only dress shirt he owned, bought second-hand from Goodwill 2 weeks ago specifically for this interview. The fabric clung to his skin as he jogged toward the sedan, his work boots finding better traction in the mud than the woman's heels ever could. She turned at the sound of his approach, and David saw fear flash across her face, the kind of fear that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with a stranger appearing out of nowhere on an empty road. She was younger than he'd initially thought, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair plastered to her face and mascara running in black streaks down her cheeks. Her coat probably cost more than his truck, even with all the mud. "I don't need help." The words came out sharp defensive, a reflex that David recognized from every time someone at the VA had tried to offer assistance, every time Dorothy brought over a casserole, every time a teacher suggested Emma might qualify for the free lunch program. David stopped a few feet away, raising his hands in a gesture meant to be non-threatening. Rain poured down his face into his eyes, turning his carefully combed hair into a mess. "Ma'am, you're going to sprain your ankle if you keep pulling like that. That mud's got you." She tugged harder on her trapped foot, and David watched her heels sink another inch, watched her balance shift dangerously as the car settled deeper into the soft shoulder. He moved without thinking, closing the distance, his hands reaching for her shoe, fingers working the strap loose while his other hand steadied her calf. The leather was expensive, butter soft, completely wrong for the situation she'd found herself in. He pulled gentle but firm mechanic's hands that knew how to coax stubborn parts free without breaking them. Her foot came loose with a wet, sucking sound. The woman staggered, caught herself against the car door, breathing hard. David stepped back immediately, giving her space, aware that he was a stranger, a man she didn't know, aware that his presence might feel like a threat, even though he only meant to help. "Thank you." The words seemed forced, like they didn't come naturally, like gratitude was something she'd forgotten how to express. David nodded, already turning back toward his truck. 8:51, 9 minutes. He could still make it if he left right now, if he pushed the Ford past safety, if he caught every light green and didn't hit traffic. His hand was on the truck's door handle when he heard the wet thud of her trying to walk in. One shoe heard the frustrated sound she made when her stockinged foot slipped in the mud. The truck had a tow chain in the bed. 10-foot length of galvanized steel that he'd bought 5 years ago for exactly this kind of situation, used it twice to pull out neighbors during bad weather, kept meaning to sell it when money got tight but never quite got around to it. David grabbed the chain, the metal cold and heavy in his hands, and carried it back to the sedan without letting himself think about what he was doing, without calculating the cost. The woman watched him approach, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" "Getting you out." David crouched by the sedan's front bumper, looking for a solid tow point, finding it in the frame beneath the decorative plastic. He threaded the chain through, testing the connection with a hard pull, then carried the other end back to his truck. The hook caught on his bumper with a solid click. "Get inside your car." His voice came out rougher than he intended, adrenaline and urgency making it sharp. "Put it in neutral. Don't touch the brake." She hesitated, and David saw the war playing out behind her eyes, the same calculation he'd been making a minute ago. Trust or walk away, accept help or protect yourself. Then she nodded, climbing into the sedan with more grace than should have been possible given the circumstances. David got back in his truck, shifted into four-wheel drive and pressed the accelerator with the same careful pressure he'd use on a seized bolt, steady and relentless. The chain went taut. The Ford's engine roared, tires spinning for a heart-stopping second before catching before the truck lurched forward and the sedan followed mud, releasing its grip in one violent moment. He kept pulling until both vehicles were on solid pavement, then killed the engine and climbed out to unhook the chain. His dress shirt was ruined brown with mud and road grime. His pants weren't much better. He looked like he'd been working construction, not heading to an interview for a position that required business casual attire and a professional demeanor. The woman lowered her window as David approached, rain still hammering down around them. She held out several bills, 20s by the look of them, maybe $100 total. "At least take this." David shook his head, coiling the chain as he walked back to his truck. "No need. I'm already late for my interview." "An interview?" Something shifted in her voice, surprise or interest, or maybe both. "Where Anderson Technologies." He tossed the chain into the truck bed, the clang of metal on metal sharp even over the storm. The woman stared at him, and David couldn't read the expression on her face, couldn't tell if it was shock or disbelief or something else entirely. Before she could say anything else, he climbed into the truck, the door closing with a hollow thud. The clock read 8:57. 3 minutes. Impossible now. Even if he drove like he'd stolen the truck, even if every single light cooperated, he'd be at least 20 minutes late. The sick feeling in his stomach had nothing to do with the rain or the cold. David put the truck in gear and pulled back onto Route 9, watching the black sedan disappear in his rearview mirror, already starting to shrink into memory, into the story he'd tell Emma tonight about why Daddy didn't get the job, about how sometimes doing the right thing cost you everything, but you did it anyway, because that was what Mommy would have wanted. The rain followed him all the way to Anderson Technologies. By the time he pulled into the parking lot, the dashboard clock showed 9:23, and David's hands were shaking, though whether from cold or anger or despair he couldn't quite say. The building rose up in front of him, all glass and steel, the kind of corporate monument that looked like it cost more to maintain than he'd earn in a lifetime. His reflection stared back at him from the lobby doors. A black man in a ruined shirt, mud-stained pants, looking like he'd just climbed out of a ditch instead of trying to climb into a better life. The receptionist's smile died when she saw him. Professional courtesy replaced by professional distance, the kind of shift David had seen 1,000 times, the subtle repositioning that happened when people looked at him and saw threat instead of person. He gave his name, watched her type it into her computer, watched the smile fail to return. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller." Her voice was flat, reciting policy instead of making exceptions. "Your interview slot has been canceled. We don't accommodate tardiness." "I can explain—" David started, but she was already shaking her head, already looking past him to the door, already dismissing him in the way that people learned to dismiss men like him, men who showed up late and muddy and desperate. "You're welcome to reapply during our next recruitment cycle. 6 months from now." 6 months. The words hit like a physical blow. 6 months of stretching $52 across groceries and rent and Emma's medication. 6 months of Dorothy Harris bringing casseroles because she could see them starving and was too kind to say it out loud. 6 months of watching Emma try to hide how much she needed things. New shoes for gym class, supplies for art projects, the normal life an 8-year-old deserved, but her father couldn't provide. David nodded, not trusting his voice, and turned away from the receptionist's manufactured sympathy. His boots left muddy prints across the pristine lobby floor, and he didn't care about anything except getting back to his truck before the tears started, before he broke down in front of strangers who'd remember him as the guy who couldn't even show up on time. The rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse, the sky opening up like it had personal grievances to settle. David sat in the truck, engine off, watching water stream down the windshield, and let himself feel the full weight of failure. His phone buzzed again. Dorothy this time. He answered without thinking. "David, honey, did Emma get her inhaler this morning?" Dorothy's voice was gentle, careful, the tone people used when they were trying not to panic you while definitely panicking themselves. His stomach dropped. "She didn't take it with her. I thought you gave it to her before I came over. She's saying you both forgot." The prescription bottle sat on his kitchen counter right where he'd left it yesterday after picking it up from the pharmacy, the one they'd had to special order because Emma's particular dosage wasn't kept in stock. The $340 he'd pulled together from tips and odd jobs and selling the power tools Sarah's father had left him in the will. $340 sitting on a counter while his daughter walked around school with lungs that could close up if she ran too hard in gym class. "I'll bring it to the school." David's voice sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I can go get it if you're still at your interview." "Interview's done. I'll handle it." He ended the call before Dorothy could ask how it went, before he had to find words for the kind of failure that had layers that started with choosing to help a stranger and ended with his daughter potentially in the emergency room because he couldn't keep track of medication schedules while juggling job interviews and toe chains and all the other pieces of a life that kept breaking faster than he could fix them. The drive back to his apartment took 15 minutes through neighborhoods that got progressively worse, houses giving way to apartment complexes with peeling paint and broken windows. The kind of place where kids played in parking lots because the playgrounds had been condemned and nobody cared enough to replace them. David's building was third from the corner, identical to every other building except for the specific pattern of water stains on the exterior walls. The eviction notice was still taped to his door, bright orange and impossible to miss. 7 days to vacate or face legal action. He'd been hoping the interview would give him leverage to negotiate a promise of future income that might convince the landlord to extend his deadline. That hope was dead now, buried in the same grave as his career prospects. David grabbed the inhaler from the kitchen counter, shoving it in his pocket as he headed back out into the rain. The elementary school was 10 minutes away, and he made it in 7, parking in the visitor lot and jogging through puddles to the front entrance. The secretary recognized him, waved him through without making him sign in, and he found Emma's 3rd grade classroom just as they were transitioning from math to reading. Emma's face lit up when she saw him through the door's window, but David could see the worry beneath the smile, could read the fear that came from a childhood where mom got sick and never came back, where dad might not be reliable, even though he tried so hard it hurt. He held up the inhaler, and relief washed across her features, so pure and uncomplicated that something cracked in David's chest. The teacher stepped into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind her. "Mr. Miller, is everything all right?" "Just forgot her medication this morning. My fault." "These things happen." She said it kindly, without judgment, but David heard the subtext. "These things happen to you a lot, don't they? Emma mentioned you had an important interview today. How did it go?" The lie formed before David could stop it. "Still waiting to hear back. These things take time." He gave Emma the inhaler through the classroom door, watched her tuck it into her backpack with the same careful attention Sarah used to show the same methodical precision that suggested she knew how important it was not to lose things. Her small hand waved goodbye, and David waved back, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass in his mouth. The rain followed him back to the truck. It followed him as he drove aimlessly through streets he'd known his whole life, neighborhoods where he'd grown up, where Sarah had grown up 3 blocks over, where they'd planned to raise Emma in the house they'd buy someday when the military paychecks turned into civilian career success. That future was just another ghost now haunting him with all the things he'd failed to build. David found himself at Memorial Park without planning it, parking near the entrance and walking. Despite the rain, despite having nowhere to be and nothing to do except face the truth that he'd gambled everything on one interview and lost. The park was empty, everyone with sense taking shelter, just David and the storm and the weight of every decision that had led him to this moment. He sat on a bench near the playground water, soaking through his already ruined pants, and pulled out his phone. Dorothy had left 2 more messages. Emma's school had called about an upcoming field trip that required a $20 deposit. The bank had sent an overdraft notice. The world kept spinning, kept demanding, indifferent to the fact that he had nothing left to give. The SUV appeared like something from a dream, black and expensive, pulling up to the curb with the kind of smooth precision that spoke of money and power and all the things David would never have. The rear window lowered, and the woman from the storm looked out at him. Her hair dry now, her makeup fixed, transformed from the desperate figure struggling in the mud to something polished and controlled. "Mr. Miller, her voice carried across the rain. "We need to talk." David stayed on the bench, too tired to be surprised, too defeated to care what this was about. "I don't think there's anything left to say, ma'am. I appreciate you coming to find me, but I'm not really in the mood for conversation. I think you'll want to hear this." She pushed the door open in invitation. "Please." Something in her tone made him stand, made him walk to the SUV and climb into the back seat where it was warm and dry and smelled faintly of expensive perfume. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror but said nothing. Professional discretion, or maybe just indifference to whatever drama was unfolding in the back seat. The woman extended her hand. "I should introduce myself properly. Elizabeth Anderson, CEO of Anderson Technologies." David's brain stuttered, trying to process the information, trying to reconcile the mud-covered woman from 2 hours ago with the executive sitting next to him now. "You're the CEO." "I am." Elizabeth's expression was unreadable. "And you're the man who sacrificed his interview to pull me out of a ditch." "I didn't know who you were." "Exactly." She leaned forward slightly, studying him with the kind of intensity that felt like being dissected. "Do you know how many people drove past me this morning? I counted 47 cars before you stopped. 47 people who saw someone in trouble and decided their day was more important." David shook his head. "They probably had their own emergencies, their own reasons. Maybe, or maybe they just didn't care enough to inconvenience themselves." Elizabeth pulled a tablet from her bag, tapping the screen until it showed what looked like a personnel file. David's own face stared back at him, younger in his marine dress uniform. "I had my assistant pull your application while you were driving here. David Miller, 36, former Marine Sergeant, 2 tours overseas, honorable discharge 6 years ago. Married Sarah Chen." "Sarah Miller." David interrupted the correction automatic. "She took my name." Elizabeth nodded, making a note on her tablet. "Sarah Miller deceased 3 years ago from breast cancer. One daughter, Emma, age 8. Currently employed at Burke's Auto Repair, making $14 an hour. No criminal record. Credit score in the low 500s due to medical debt. Eviction notice filed 3 days ago." She looked up from the screen. "Did I miss anything?" The clinical recitation of his life felt like being stripped naked, every failure and loss cataloged and displayed. "Why does any of that matter? I was late. You have policies." "We have policies because most people require them. Structure, rules, consequences." Elizabeth closed the tablet. "But most people wouldn't stop in a storm to help a stranger. Most people would have driven past just like those other 47. That doesn't change the fact that I missed the interview." "No, but it tells me something our interview process wouldn't have." She leaned back, considering him. "Anderson Technologies has a problem, a serious one. Our logistics system crashed 3 weeks ago, and my team of 20 engineers hasn't been able to fix it. We're losing $2 million a day. Partners are threatening to walk. The board is questioning my leadership." David frowned. "With all due respect, ma'am, I'm a mechanic. I fix engines, not computer systems." "You were applying for senior logistics analyst, which suggests you have relevant skills beyond fixing engines, and your military record shows expertise in supply chain management under combat conditions, which is exactly the kind of pressure we're facing." Elizabeth's eyes held his. "I'm offering you a chance, 48 hours to look at our system and tell me what my experts are missing. If you can't help, we part ways and you've lost nothing. If you can, I'll give you the position you interviewed for." "Why would you take that risk? You don't know me." "Because this morning you showed me something money can't buy and credentials can't measure. You showed me character." Elizabeth pulled a business card from her wallet, placing it in David's palm. "The choice is yours, Mr. Miller, but I suggest you decide quickly. Your daughter's medication won't pay for itself, and that eviction notice won't disappear on its own." The card was heavy stock embossed lettering, "Elizabeth Anderson, Chief Executive Officer," a direct phone number handwritten on the back. David stared at it, trying to understand what was happening, trying to find the trap, because nothing this good came without strings attached, without some hidden cost. He'd pay later when it was too late to back out. "When would you need me to start?" "Now. Today." Elizabeth glanced at her watch. "It's not even noon. We can have you in the building within the hour, give you access to the system, see what you can do." David looked down at his mud-stained clothes at the ruin of his only dress shirt. "I'm not exactly dressed for it. We have a company store. You can buy whatever you need and we'll deduct it from your first paycheck." She said it casually, like it was nothing, like she didn't understand that buying clothes on credit was another kind of debt, another weight on shoulders already buckling under the load. But what choice did he have? Go home to an empty apartment and wait for the eviction? Pick up another shift at Burke's Auto and watch Emma's inhaler prescription run out while he counted pennies? This was a lifeline, maybe a trap disguised as a lifeline, but it was the only thing floating in reach, and he was drowning. "Okay." The word felt like jumping off a cliff. "I'll try." Elizabeth smiled, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. "That's all I'm asking." The SUV pulled back into traffic, heading toward the glass and steel monument David had walked away from an hour ago, and he watched the city slide past through tinted windows, watched his life divide into before and after. This moment, this choice, this impossible stroke of luck that felt too good to be true. Because in his experience, things that felt too good to be true usually were. But what nobody in that boardroom knew was that David's daughter Emma had a heart defect. The surgery she needed cost $150,000, and her father had exactly $52 to his name. The boardroom smelled like fear, dressed up as confidence leather chairs and polished mahogany, trying to mask the panic David could taste in the recycled air. 20 faces turned toward him as Elizabeth led him through the glass doors. 20 pairs of eyes cataloging his cheap replacement shirt from the company's store, the khakis that didn't quite fit right, the work boots he'd refused to swap for the dress shoes they'd offered, because some things you didn't compromise on, even when walking into rooms where everyone else wore suits worth more than his truck. James Walker sat at the far end of the table. Silver hair, perfectly styled expression, carved from the same expensive stone as the building itself. He didn't stand when Elizabeth entered, didn't acknowledge David's presence with anything more than a flicker of distaste that might have been subtle to anyone who hadn't spent 36 years learning to read contempt in all its variations. "Miss Anderson, with all due respect, we're in a critical emergency." Walker's voice carried the weight of board meetings and quarterly reports, the authority of someone who'd never had to choose between medication and groceries. "Is it wise to bring in an outsider who's not even an employee?" Elizabeth moved to the head of the table and David watched the room shift, watched power dynamics play out in posture and proximity. "I didn't ask for your opinion, James. I made this decision because I believe Mr. Miller has capabilities we desperately need." Walker's jaw tightened, but he settled back into his chair, fingers drumming against the armrest in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained frustration. David remained standing near the door, aware that he didn't belong in this room, didn't have the credentials or the polish or the right last name to be trusted with whatever crisis had these people sweating beneath their expensive cologne. A younger woman, maybe 40, slid a laptop across the table toward an empty chair. "Mr. Miller, if you'd like to take a look at what we're dealing with." David sat the leather chair, groaning under his weight in a way that felt accusatory. The screen showed lines of code system architecture diagrams, error logs scrolling past faster than he could track. His hands hovered over the keyboard, and for one terrible moment he questioned everything. Questioned whether that marine supply chain training from a decade ago had any relevance to corporate logistics networks, whether Elizabeth had made a catastrophic mistake, pulling him off a park bench and dropping him into the deep end. But nobody in that boardroom knew was that David had spent 2 years in Kandahar, managing supply routes through hostile territory, tracking everything from ammunition to medical supplies across distances where one wrong calculation meant soldiers died. He'd learned to think in systems, in networks, in the fragile connections that held operations together when chaos tried to tear them apart. "Walk me through the timeline." David's voice came out, steady mechanic's pragmatism overriding the imposter syndrome clawing at his throat. "When did the system first crash, and what were you doing immediately before?" A thin man in wireframe glasses leaned forward, tablet in hand. 3 weeks ago, Tuesday morning, 0600 hours, we pushed a routine update to the routing database standard maintenance protocol. Within 90 minutes, the entire logistics network went offline. Distribution centers couldn't communicate with warehouses. Carriers lost access to shipment. Tracking customers stopped receiving delivery confirmations. David scrolled through the error logs looking for patterns in the chaos. What did your team try first? Server restart, obviously. Then we rolled back the update, but the system wouldn't stabilize. Tried rebuilding the database from backups, but corruption had already spread through the redundancies. The man's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting this battle for 3 straight weeks. We've had our best engineers on it around the clock. Nothing works. Because you're treating the symptom, not the disease. David stopped scrolling, finger pointing to a cluster of errors buried deep in the logs. See this duplicate address entries in the shipment routing table. Every time a warehouse tries to send data to the central hub, the system sees 2 identical destinations and locks up, trying to decide which one to use. It's not the servers failing, it's the database choking on its own redundancy protocols. Walker's voice cut through the sudden silence. Impossible. I personally designed that database architecture. There are no duplicate entries. David looked up, meeting the older man's gaze without flinching. With respect, sir, there are. Right here and probably a dozen other places if I keep looking. The update you pushed 3 weeks ago didn't create the problem. It just finally triggered a vulnerability that's been sitting in your system for months, maybe years. The thin man was already typing, pulling up database records, and David watched his expression shift from skepticism to shock. He's right. Jesus Christ, he's right. How did we miss this? Because you were looking at the wrong layer of the problem. David pushed back from the laptop, the leather chair squeaking again. You focused on the servers because that's where the visible errors appeared. But the root cause was buried in the database management system, and your automated diagnostic tools weren't designed to flag this specific type of conflict. Elizabeth leaned against the table, arms crossed, and David couldn't read the expression on her face. Pride, maybe, or vindication, or just relief that she hadn't gambled on the wrong horse. Can you fix it? Give me 30 minutes and access to the database console. I can clear the duplicate entries and restart the routing protocols. David stood, suddenly aware that everyone in the room was staring at him with a mix of respect and resentment, the kind of attention that came from being right when everyone else had been catastrophically wrong. But you'll want your engineers watching what I do, because this will happen again if you don't address the underlying architecture issues. Walker remained frozen in his chair, face pale, watching his carefully constructed authority crumble in real time. This is absurd. We can't just hand over root access to our entire logistics network to someone we hired an hour ago. Then you can explain to the board why we're still losing $2 million a day. Elizabeth's voice carried the edge of someone who'd run out of patience for politics and ego. David, you have your 30 minutes. Show us what you can do. The next 28 minutes passed in a blur of terminal commands and database queries. David's fingers moving across the keyboard with the same confidence he brought to rebuilding carburetors, treating code like machinery. Understanding that systems were systems whether they ran on diesel or data. The engineers crowded around taking notes, asking questions, and David answered while he worked, explaining each step in language stripped of jargon, mechanics, explanations for programmers who'd forgotten that complexity often masked simple problems. The main display screen at the front of the boardroom showed the logistics network map, hundreds of nodes across the country, all glowing red for offline. David watched those lights as he executed the final command sequence, watched the cascade of greens spread across the map like dawn-breaking distribution centers, coming back online one by one, connections re-establishing the whole fragile network, knitting itself back together. Someone started clapping, then someone else. Within seconds, the entire boardroom was applauding engineers, shaking his hand, executives who'd looked at him like a janitor 30 minutes ago, now treating him like he'd personally saved their careers. David accepted the praise with mechanical nods, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how helping a stranger in the rain had somehow led to this moment. Elizabeth stood apart from the celebration, watching him with those same unreadable eyes. When the noise finally died down, she addressed the room. I'm appointing David Miller as Senior Logistics Analyst effective immediately. He'll report directly to me while we implement the permanent fixes to prevent this from happening again." Walker rose from his chair, movement stiff with suppressed fury. "You're making a mistake, Elizabeth. We know nothing about this man's background, his qualifications. I know he saved this company $15 million in losses and solved a problem your team couldn't fix in 3 weeks." Elizabeth's tone left no room for argument. "If you have concerns, James, you can bring them to the board. Until then, David stays." The meeting dissolved after that executives filing out with their phones already pressed to their ears. Crisis averted catastrophe. Postponed business returning to the familiar rhythms of quarterly targets and shareholder value. David gathered the notes he'd scribbled during the repair process, technical documentation for the engineers to reference, aware that Walker was still standing by the window staring out at the city like it had personally betrayed him. Elizabeth touched David's elbow, guiding him toward a side exit. "We should get you properly set up. Office, computer access, benefits, enrollment, the works." "I don't need an office." The words came out harder than David intended. "Just tell me what you need me to do, and I'll do it. What I need is for you to understand that you belong here now. This isn't temporary, David. This is real." She paused at the elevator, pressing the call button. "Unless you have somewhere else you need to be." David thought about the eviction notice, about Emma waiting for him to pick her up from school, about Dorothy Harris probably making dinner for both of them because she knew David hadn't been to the grocery store in a week. "My daughter gets out at 3:30. I need to be there. Then we'll work around it. Family comes first always." Elizabeth stepped into the elevator when it arrived, and David followed, watching their reflections in the polished steel doors. "I meant what I said this morning. Character matters more than credentials. You proved that twice today, and I don't forget debts." The elevator descended in silence, and David tried to reconcile the CEO who'd offered him a lifeline with the woman he'd pulled from the mud, tried to understand what kind of person built a $2 billion company, but still noticed the mechanic in the ruined shirt. The doors opened onto the executive floor, all glass walls and modern furniture, the kind of space designed to intimidate anyone who didn't belong in rooms where decisions shaped thousands of lives. "This is you." Elizabeth gestured to an office near the corner, smaller than hers, but still twice the size of David's entire apartment. "Computer's already set up with your credentials. IT will get you a phone and laptop by end of day. Salary's $48,000 base plus benefits. Health insurance kicks in immediately, no waiting period." David stepped into the office, touching the desk like it might evaporate under his fingers. $48,000 a year. Health insurance. The numbers didn't feel real. Felt like someone else's life he'd accidentally walked into. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you stopped when 47 other people didn't." Elizabeth moved to the window, looking out over the parking lot where his battered Ford sat among the Audis and BMWs. "I built this company from nothing, David. I know what it's like to be dismissed because you don't fit someone's mental image of success. I know what it feels like when one person decides to take a chance on you instead of writing you off." She turned back to face him. "Consider this my way of paying it forward." The conversation ended there. Elizabeth returning to her office while David sat in his chair in his office, trying to make sense of a morning that had started with failure and somehow transformed into the kind of opportunity he'd stopped believing in. His phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy. "Emma's asking about the interview. What should I tell her?" David's fingers hovered over the keyboard, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself. Finally he typed, "Tell her Dad got the job. I'll explain everything when I pick her up." The afternoon passed in a haze of HR paperwork and orientation sessions, David signing documents he barely read, agreeing to direct deposit and 401k contributions and all the infrastructure of a normal corporate job, the kind of stability he'd been chasing since leaving the Marines. An IT specialist showed up with a laptop and phone, walked him through the network security protocols, gave him access to systems he'd need to do his job. At 3:15, David grabbed his keys and headed for the elevator, aware of the stares from other employees, the whispers that followed him through the halls. The new guy who'd fixed the impossible problem, the mechanic who'd somehow ended up on the executive floor. He ignored them all, focused on getting to Emma's school before the bell rang, on keeping the one promise that mattered more than all the corporate credentials in the world. Emma was waiting by the front entrance when he pulled up, backpack slung over one shoulder. Hair in the braids Dorothy had probably helped with that morning. She climbed into the truck with the careful movements of a kid who'd learned early that everything was fragile, that one wrong move could shatter the precarious balance holding their life together. "Dorothy said you got the job." Her voice was small, tentative, not quite daring to hope. David pulled out of the school lot, trying to find words that wouldn't sound like empty promises. "I did. It's complicated, but yeah, I got it." "Does that mean we don't have to move?" The question hit like a gut punch. The reminder that 8-year-olds shouldn't have to worry about eviction notices, shouldn't carry the weight of adult anxieties on shoulders, still learning to bear the loss of their mother. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart. Better than okay. This job, it's going to change things for us." Emma nodded, but David saw the skepticism in her eyes, the learned wariness of a child who'd watched promises crumble before. She pulled her homework from her backpack, math worksheets covered in careful numbers, and settled into working while David drove them home through traffic that felt lighter somehow, like the universe had decided to cut him a break for once. Dorothy was waiting on her porch when they arrived, arms crossed against the autumn chill, face breaking into a smile when she saw Emma hop out of the truck. "There's my girl. How was school?" "Fine. Dad got a job." Emma said it matter-of-factly, like it was just another piece of information, not the pivot point their entire future balanced on. Dorothy's eyes found David's over Emma's head, questions written in the lines around her mouth. "That's so, the Anderson Technologies position." "It's a long story." David helped Emma with her backpack. "I'll tell you over dinner if you're cooking." "Always am." Dorothy ushered them inside toward the smell of pot roast and vegetables, the kind of meal David couldn't remember the last time he'd made from scratch. "You two wash up. Food'll be ready in 5 minutes." They ate at Dorothy's dining table, the one that had belonged to her husband before the heart attack took him 7 years back, and David told the story of his morning in pieces between bites, editing out the worst of his desperation, focusing on the mechanics of fixing the logistics system, rather than the miracle of Elizabeth Anderson appearing in the park like some corporate guardian angel. Dorothy listened without interrupting, but David could see her processing, could watch her grandmother's intuition working through the details, finding the gaps in his narrative. When he finished, she set down her fork with deliberate care. "This woman, this CEO, she just offered you a $48,000 job because you pulled her car from the mud. She offered it because I fixed a problem her engineers couldn't solve. After she brought you to the office because you stopped to help her." Dorothy's gaze was sharp, cutting through the story to the uncomfortable truth beneath. "David, honey, that's not how the world works. Rich people don't hand out 6-figure opportunities to mechanics they met on the side of the road." Emma had gone quiet, fork suspended halfway to her mouth, listening to adult conversation she wasn't supposed to understand, but clearly did. David chose his words carefully, aware that whatever he said would shape how his daughter viewed this opportunity, this change in their circumstances. "I think Elizabeth sees something in me that other people miss. And yeah, maybe that's unusual, maybe it's not how things normally work. But I'm not going to question it, Dorothy. I'm going to show up, do the job, prove I deserve the chance she gave me. Just be careful." Dorothy reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "People with that kind of money, they don't do things without reasons. Make sure you understand what she really wants before you get in too deep." The warning lingered after dinner, after David and Emma returned to their own apartment after he'd helped her with homework and gotten her ready for bed. Emma fell asleep with her sketchbook open beside her, colored pencils scattered across the blanket, and David carefully gathered them up, putting everything in the art supply box he'd bought at a yard sale 3 months ago. Sarah had been an artist, nothing professional, just someone who saw beauty in ordinary things and translated it onto paper with the kind of patience David had never possessed. Emma had inherited that gift, spent hours drawing elaborate scenes of places she'd never been, people she'd never met, worlds conjured from imagination, because reality didn't offer much worth capturing. David studied her latest sketch, A family of 3 standing in front of a house with a yard, a dog playing nearby. The kind of simple dream that felt impossible when you were counting pennies for bus fare. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number, probably spam, but David answered anyway because you never knew when Emma's school might be calling from a different line, when the hospital might have questions about outstanding bills. "Mr. Miller." A woman's voice, professional, unfamiliar. "This is Dr. Rachel Kim from Children's Mercy Hospital. I'm calling about Emma Miller, your daughter." David's grip tightened on the phone, dread flooding through his veins like ice water. "What's wrong?" "She's right here. She's fine." "I apologize for the confusion. Emma's not in immediate danger, but her pediatrician flagged some concerning results from her last checkup and asked me to follow up. I'm a pediatric cardiologist, and I'd like to schedule some additional tests to rule out a potential heart condition." The words washed over David in fragments: irregular heartbeat, possible valve issue, need to monitor, better safe than sorry. His own heart was hammering now, pulse loud in his ears, and he forced himself to breathe, to think, to not wake Emma with the panic clawing its way up his throat. "What kind of tests? How much do they cost?" Dr. Kim's voice gentled the shift of a medical professional who'd delivered bad news to scared parents 1,000 times before. "Let's not worry about cost right now. First, we need to determine if there's actually a problem. Can you bring Emma in tomorrow afternoon? I have an opening at 4 o'clock. David looked at the insurance card sitting on his dresser, the temporary one HR had given him that afternoon, the one that probably wouldn't even be active for another 2 weeks, while paperwork processed through whatever bureaucratic machinery handled such things. "I just started a new job today. Insurance might not be in effect yet. We'll figure something out. Emma's health is the priority." "Doctor." Kim gave him the address, the floor, the specific department to ask for. "Try not to worry too much, Mr. Miller. Most of the time these turn out to be nothing. But sometimes they weren't nothing. Sometimes they were the kind of something that changed everything, that turned good days into nightmares, that reminded you how fragile the whole structure really was, how quickly a stable foundation could crumble into dust." David ended the call and sat in the darkness of his bedroom, listening to Emma breathe in the next room, trying not to think about Sarah's final months, about hospital rooms and treatment protocols, and all the ways the human body could betray the people who depended on it. He'd survived war, survived loss, survived 3 years of barely holding together. But the thought of Emma sick, Emma suffering, Emma facing the same fate as her mother, that was a fear that lived in his bones, that woke him up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat, heart racing from dreams where he arrived too late to save her. The next morning came too fast. David called Anderson Technologies. From the truck, explained the situation to whoever answered the general office line, asked if it was possible to leave early for a medical appointment. The receptionist put him on hold, elevator music playing for 90 seconds that felt like 90 years before Elizabeth's voice came on the line. "David, what's going on?" He explained about Dr. Kim's call, about the tests, about needing to leave at 3:30 to make the 4 o'clock appointment. Elizabeth listened without interrupting, and David could hear her typing in the background, probably checking his personnel file, probably wondering if she'd made a mistake hiring someone who was already requesting special accommodations on day 2. "Of course you should go. Family first, remember." Her tone shifted business executive to something warmer, more personal. "Do you need anything? Someone to sit with Emma during the tests? Help with paperwork?" "We'll manage. But thank you." "David," Elizabeth's voice carried a weight he couldn't quite identify. "I mean it. If you need help, ask. That's what the Employee Assistance Program is for, and if that's not enough, you come directly to me." "Understood." He agreed, ended the call, and spent the day trying to focus on work while his mind kept drifting to worst-case scenarios. The other logistics analysts treated him with a mix of respect and suspicion, asking questions about his background, his qualifications, clearly trying to understand how a mechanic had leapfrogged over candidates with master's degrees and years of corporate experience. David answered honestly, didn't hide the fact that he'd gotten lucky, that Elizabeth had taken a chance on him, and gradually the tension eased into something approaching acceptance. At 3:15, he logged off his computer and headed for the parking lot, trying to ignore the guilt that came from leaving early when everyone else was still grinding through their workday. Emma was waiting at school, and David tried to keep his expression neutral as she climbed into the truck, tried not to let her see the fear that had been building all day. "We need to make a stop before going home." He pulled into traffic, hands steady on the wheel even though everything inside him was shaking. "Doctor's appointment. Nothing serious, just some routine tests." Emma's face went carefully blank, the expression she wore when trying not to show she was scared. "What kind of tests?" "Heart stuff. Your pediatrician wants to make sure everything's working right." David forced a smile. "Probably nothing, but better to check right." Children's Mercy Hospital rose up on the east side of downtown, all modern architecture and healing gardens, the kind of place that spent millions on looking non-threatening while families received the worst news of their lives inside. David found parking, helped Emma out of the truck, and walked with her through the main entrance like they were heading to any normal appointment, instead of potentially discovering whether his daughter had inherited more than just her mother's artistic talent. Dr. Kim was younger than David expected, maybe 35, with kind eyes and steady hands, as she examined Emma, listening to her heart with a stethoscope that probably cost more than David's monthly rent. Emma sat quietly on the examination table, answering questions about whether she ever felt dizzy, whether running made her chest hurt, whether she'd noticed anything unusual about how her body felt. The tests took an hour. EKG, echocardiogram, blood pressure monitoring. Emma hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed, while David sat in a plastic chair trying to read a magazine without processing a single word. Dr. Kim studied the results with the focused intensity of someone trained to find problems in data that looked normal to untrained eyes. Finally, she turned to David, and he knew from her expression that this wasn't going to be one of those times when everything turned out to be nothing. "Emma has a congenital heart defect, specifically a ventricular septal defect. There's a hole between the lower chambers of her heart, and it's causing blood to flow improperly." "Doctor?" Kim pulled up images on her computer screen, pointing to shadowy shapes that might as well have been abstract art for all David understood. "It's been there since birth, but her pediatrician wouldn't have caught it without the specific symptoms Emma's been showing lately, the fatigue, the occasional dizziness." Emma was watching them both, reading the tension in the room with the same perceptiveness that let her capture emotion in her sketches. David forced himself to breathe, to stay calm, to ask the questions a father needed to ask. "What's the treatment?" "Surgery. We need to patch the hole before it causes permanent damage to her heart or lungs." Dr. Kim's voice remained steady, professional. "It's a delicate procedure, but we have excellent success rates. The sooner we schedule it, the better her long-term prognosis." David's throat was desert dry, words sticking like sandpaper. "How much does something like this cost, doctor?" Kim glanced at Emma, clearly not wanting to discuss finances in front of the patient, but David shook his head. Emma deserved to know, deserved to understand what they were facing. She'd lived through her mother's cancer, learned early that medical crises weren't abstract concepts, but real events that changed lives. "Without insurance, we're looking at around $150,000. But your new coverage through Anderson Technologies won't be active for 2 weeks. David felt the number settle into his chest like a weight, crushing whatever hope had survived the morning. "And you said we need to do this soon. Within the next month, ideally." Dr. Kim hesitated, clearly running calculations of her own. "There are payment plans, financial assistance programs. We'll work with you to find a solution." David stood, needing to move, needing to do something other than sit in this chair absorbing information that felt like bullets. "Can I have a minute with my daughter?" Dr. Kim nodded, stepping out into the hallway, and David pulled Emma into a hug that was probably too tight, too desperate, but he couldn't help it. His little girl, his reason for getting up every morning, needed surgery that cost more than he'd earn in 3 years, needed it soon, and he had exactly the $48,000 salary he'd started yesterday to somehow make this work. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart." The lie tasted bitter, but what else could he say? Daddy's going to figure this out. Emma pulled back, and David saw Sarah in her face, saw that same quiet strength that had carried his wife through 14 months of chemotherapy before the cancer finally won. "I'm scared." "Me too." At least that was honest. "But Dr. Kim said this is fixable and we're going to fix it. I promise." They left the hospital with appointment cards for pre-surgical consultations, with pamphlets about congenital heart defects and recovery timelines, with a weight on David's shoulders that made the eviction notice seem trivial by comparison. Emma was quiet on the drive home, staring out the window at neighborhoods sliding past, and David let the silence stretch, gave her space to process whatever an 8-year-old processed when learning her heart was broken and needed strangers with scalpels to make it whole. Dorothy was watering her garden when they pulled up, and she took one look at David's face and knew. "How bad?" "Heart surgery, $150,000. David helped Emma out of the truck, watched her walk slowly toward their apartment, like the diagnosis had added years to her small frame. "Insurance won't kick in for 2 weeks, and we can't wait that long." Dorothy set down her watering can, reaching out to steady David, when he swayed when the full weight of impossible circumstances finally broke through the adrenaline that had been holding him upright. "You call that boss of yours, the one who gave you the job. You tell her what's happening." "I can't ask for money, I just started." "You're not asking. You're explaining the situation to your employer, who has employee assistance programs for exactly this kind of emergency." Dorothy's grip was iron, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You swallow your pride, David Miller. You swallow it, and you do whatever it takes to save that child, you hear me?" He heard her. God help him. He heard her even as everything in him recoiled from the thought of begging, of going to Elizabeth with his hand out like some kind of charity case, of admitting that the stability he'd felt for exactly 36 hours was already crumbling under the weight of medical reality. But Emma needed surgery. Emma needed it soon. And David would crawl through broken glass if that's what it took to keep her alive. David stood outside Elizabeth's office at 7:30 the next morning, coffee cooling in his hand, rehearsing words that kept dissolving before they reached his tongue. Through the glass wall he could see her bent over paperwork, reading glasses perched on her nose, the kind of focused intensity that suggested she'd been here since dawn. 3 times he raised his hand to knock. 3 times he lowered it, shame and desperation warring in his chest until he couldn't tell which emotion was winning. The decision was made for him when Elizabeth glanced up, caught his reflection in her computer monitor, and waved him inside. David entered like a man approaching execution, every step an admission of failure, of need, of the 1,000 ways life had conspired to remind him that one good day didn't erase 3 years of drowning. "You're here early." Elizabeth removed her glasses, studying him with the same careful attention she'd given to quarterly reports moments before. "Everything all right?" The question was casual professional concern, but David heard the real inquiry beneath was the new hire already flaking, already proving to be a mistake. He set his coffee on the edge of her desk, hands empty, now nothing left to hold on to. "Emma needs surgery. Heart defect, congenital, been there since birth, but only just causing problems." The words came out clinical, detached, like he was describing someone else's crisis instead of his daughter's mortality. "Doctor says it's urgent. Within the month, probably sooner." Elizabeth's expression shifted, warmth flooding into features that had been purely business seconds ago. "What can I do?" "I don't know." David's voice cracked, years of holding himself together fracturing under the weight of impossible arithmetic. "Insurance doesn't activate for 2 weeks, and the surgery costs $150,000. And I know there are employee assistance programs, but I just started and I have no right to ask." "Stop." Elizabeth stood, moving around the desk until she was close enough that David could smell her perfume, something expensive and subtle. "You're not asking. I'm offering. The company has emergency medical funds for exactly this situation. I can't take charity. It's not charity, it's benefits. Part of your compensation package." She pulled out her phone, already typing. "I'm connecting you with our benefits coordinator. They'll walk you through the paperwork, get the hospital paid directly, make sure Emma gets the care she needs." David shook his head, the refusal automatic, decades of self-reliance hardwired into his DNA. "I won't take money I didn't earn. That's not how I was raised, that's not who I am. Elizabeth's eyes went hard, the CEO returning with the force of someone who'd built empires by refusing to accept no as an answer. Your pride is going to kill your daughter. Is that really the hill you want to die on? The words hit like a physical blow, stripping away every defense David had constructed, every justification for refusing help. He thought about Emma on that examination table, about the hole in her heart pumping blood in directions it was never meant to go, about Dr. Kim's careful explanation of permanent damage and long-term prognosis, and all the ways waiting could transform fixable into fatal. I don't know how to do this. His voice came out broken raw. I don't know how to be the kind of man who takes handouts, who can't provide for his own child. You're not taking a handout. You're accepting the benefits you earned by saving this company millions of dollars. Elizabeth's tone gentled steel wrapped in velvet. David, listen to me. I grew up poor. Welfare. Poor food stamps. Poor eviction notices on the door. Poor. I know what pride costs when you're trying to survive, and I'm telling you right now, Emma's life is worth more than your ego. The truth of it settled into David's bones, cold and final. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and Elizabeth made the call to HR, explaining the situation in efficient sentences that reduced his desperation to actionable items on someone's checklist. Within an hour, David was sitting in a conference room with a benefits coordinator who walked him through forms and waivers and financial assistance applications that would allegedly cover Emma's surgery through some combination of corporate emergency funds and payment plans that wouldn't destroy what little financial stability he'd managed to build. The company will pay the hospital directly. The coordinator, a woman named Patricia, with the patient demeanor of someone who'd handled 1,000 similar crises, slid a document across the table. You'll need to sign here acknowledging that you're accepting emergency medical assistance and here authorizing direct payment to Children's Mercy Hospital. David signed each stroke of the pen, feeling like surrender and salvation in equal measure. When it was done, Patricia collected the paperwork with a reassuring smile. Doctor, Kim's office will receive confirmation within 24 hours. Your daughter can be scheduled for surgery as soon as the medical team determines she's ready. Walking back to his office felt like moving underwater, everything muffled and distant. David sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen without seeing it, trying to process what had just happened. Elizabeth had solved his crisis with a phone call, and some paperwork had made the impossible routine, had demonstrated the kind of power that came from having resources David couldn't even conceptualize. His phone buzzed. Dorothy texting, "How did it go? Did you talk to her?" David typed back, "It's handled. Surgery will be covered." The response came immediately. "Thank God. You did the right thing, honey." But it didn't feel right. It felt like failure, like proving that everything Dorothy had worried about was true, that rich people didn't do things without reasons, that David had somehow become indebted to Elizabeth Anderson in ways he couldn't yet calculate. He pushed the thought away, focused on work, on justifying his presence in this office by making himself useful. The week passed in a blur of medical appointments and pre-surgical consultations. Emma underwent more tests, met with the surgical team, received a crash course in what would happen when they opened her chest and patched the hole that had been killing her slowly since birth. She handled it with the same quiet courage Sarah had shown, asking intelligent questions, nodding at explanations, only showing fear when she thought David wasn't looking. They scheduled the surgery for the following Friday, 8 days away, and David marked the date on his calendar like it was an execution rather than a healing, counting down hours until strangers would hold his daughter's life in their hands while he waited in some antiseptic room and pretended to believe in positive outcomes. Thursday afternoon, David was reviewing logistics reports when Elizabeth appeared at his office door, expression unreadable. "Do you have dinner plans tonight?" The question caught him off guard, too casual for their professional relationship, too friendly for the distance he'd been trying to maintain since accepting her help with Emma's surgery. "Just picking up Emma from school and heating up whatever Dorothy left in our fridge." "Why, I thought you might want to grab a meal. Talk about something other than work." Elizabeth leaned against the doorframe, and David noticed she wasn't wearing her usual corporate armor, had traded the power suit for jeans and a sweater that made her look younger, more approachable. "There's a diner near Emma's school. Good burgers, better pie. My treat. David's instinct was to refuse to maintain the boundaries that kept employees separate from executives, but something in Elizabeth's expression stopped him. Not manipulation or ulterior motive, just loneliness. The kind of isolation that came from being the person everyone deferred to but nobody really knew. Emma likes pie. He heard himself agreeing before conscious thought caught up with the words. We could meet you there around 4:30. The diner was called Murphy's, a relic from when the neighborhood had been working-class Irish instead of gentrifying professional red vinyl booths and a jukebox that probably still played if you fed it quarters. Elizabeth was already there when David arrived, with Emma sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee and a book she closed when she saw them enter. Emma hesitated, suddenly shy, and David realized his daughter had never actually met. Elizabeth had only heard about her in abstract terms as the boss who'd given Dad a job, the CEO, who'd helped with the hospital bills. Elizabeth seemed to sense the awkwardness, staying seated, instead of approaching, letting Emma come to her on her own terms. You must be Emma. Your dad's told me a lot about you. Elizabeth's voice was gentle, stripped of the authority she wielded in boardrooms. I heard you're an artist. Emma glanced at David, seeking permission, and he nodded encouragement. She slid into the booth across from Elizabeth's backpack, still on, clearly prepared for quick escape if this turned out to be uncomfortable. I like to draw. What do you draw? Places, people, sometimes things I imagine. Emma's fingers traced patterns on the table, nervous energy seeking outlet. Mom used to draw too, before she got sick. The mention of Sarah created a moment of silence, heavy with the weight of loss that never quite disappeared, just got easier to carry. Elizabeth didn't try to fill it with platitudes, didn't offer the kind of empty sympathy that made grief harder instead of lighter. She just nodded, acknowledging the statement without demanding more. David ordered for both of them burgers and fries and chocolate pie that Emma's eyes went wide at when the waitress brought it out. They ate mostly in silence, the comfortable kind that didn't require conversation to feel natural. And David watched his daughter slowly relax, watched her guard lower as Elizabeth asked questions about school and art class, and whether Emma had thought about what she wanted to be when she grew up. A doctor, maybe? Emma pushed pie around her plate, suddenly serious. So I can fix people like the doctors are going to fix me. Elizabeth's expression went soft, and David saw something flicker behind her eyes, some personal memory or private pain that connected her to Emma's words in ways he couldn't quite read. That's a beautiful reason. The world needs more doctors who understand what it's like to be the patient. The conversation drifted after that, Elizabeth sharing stories about building Anderson Technologies from nothing, about the failures and setbacks and all the time she'd almost quit before finally breaking through. Emma listened with rapt attention, and David realized Elizabeth was doing something subtle and deliberate, showing his daughter that success wasn't magic, was just persistence plus luck plus refusing to give up when everything suggested you should. When they finished eating, Elizabeth insisted on paying, waved off David's attempt to contribute, and walked them to the parking lot where his truck sat between a Tesla and a Lexus, like a monument to economic disparity. Emma hugged Elizabeth goodbye, the gesture spontaneous and genuine, and David saw Elizabeth's surprise, the way she seemed unprepared for uncomplicated affection from a child who'd learned early that most adults disappointed you eventually. Thank you, Emma's voice was muffled against Elizabeth's sweater, for helping my dad help me. Elizabeth's arms came up slowly, returning the embrace with the careful movements of someone who'd forgotten how to accept kindness without suspicion. You're welcome, sweetheart. You're going to do great next Friday. I know it. Driving home, Emma was quieter than usual, staring out the window at streetlights beginning to glow in the autumn dusk. David let her process whatever she needed to process, didn't push for conversation. Understood that sometimes 8-year-olds needed space to think just as much as adults did. I like her. Emma's voice was small, tentative. Miss Elizabeth. She's nice. She is. David navigated through traffic, trying to reconcile the CEO who'd written a check for his daughter's surgery with the woman who'd spent an hour talking to Emma about art and dreams and futures that might actually be possible. She's been very good to us. Do you think Mom would have liked her? The question cut deeper than Emma probably intended, opening wounds David had thought were scarred over. He considered lying, offering easy comfort, but Emma deserved honesty, deserved to know that her father took her question seriously. "I think your mom would appreciate anyone who cared about you, and Miss Elizabeth clearly cares." Emma nodded, satisfied, and went back to watching the city slide past. David wondered what Sarah would have made of Elizabeth Anderson, whether his wife would have seen the same loneliness he'd glimpsed at dinner, whether she would have understood the complex arithmetic of need and generosity that had bound their lives together in ways David still couldn't fully parse. The next morning brought a call from an unknown number that David almost ignored before remembering that unknown numbers were how doctors' offices contacted you about lab results and scheduling changes. He answered, expecting Patricia from HR, or maybe Dr. Kim's nurse with some pre-surgical instruction he'd forgotten. "Mr. Miller, this is Captain Ryan Thompson with the Metro Police Department." The voice was male, authoritative, carrying the weight of badge and uniform. "I need to speak with you about your relationship with Elizabeth Anderson." David's grip tightened on the phone, confusion giving way to low-grade alarm. "I work for Miss Anderson. What's this about? I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Can you come down to the station this afternoon? Say 2 o'clock? Am I being accused of something?" "Not accused, just some questions that need answering." Thompson's tone remained professionally neutral, giving nothing away. 2 o'clock. Ask for me at the front desk." The call ended before David could respond, leaving him staring at his phone like it might explain what had just happened. He called Elizabeth's office, got routed to voicemail, left a message explaining about the police contact and asking if she knew what this was about. 20 minutes later, his phone rang with her direct line. "Don't go." Elizabeth's voice was tight, controlled fury barely contained beneath professional veneer. "Captain Thompson is my ex-fiancée. This has nothing to do with legitimate police business." David's world tilted slightly, pieces clicking into place. The way Walker had looked at Elizabeth in that first boardroom meeting, the careful distance she maintained from personal relationships, the loneliness that seemed fundamental to her existence rather than circumstantial. What does he want? To intimidate you, to make you question whether working for me is worth whatever hassle he can manufacture. Elizabeth exhaled long and slow. "We were engaged 5 years ago. I broke it off when I realized he was controlling, possessive, the kind of man who needed to own rather than love. He didn't take it well. And now he's using his badge to harass people in your life." "Apparently." The bitterness in Elizabeth's voice was sharp enough to cut. "David, I'm sorry. You don't deserve to be dragged into my personal history. If you want to distance yourself, I'll understand." "No." The word came out harder than intended. "I'm not running because your ex-boyfriend is a cop with boundary issues. But I am going to that meeting because ignoring police summons seems like a bad idea, even when they're not legitimate." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. "If you're going, I'm coming with you. Thompson needs to understand that intimidating my employees has consequences." They met in the Anderson Technologies parking lot at 1:30. Elizabeth arriving in her SUV looking like she was heading to war, power suit and heels that could double as weapons if necessary. David had changed into the closest thing to professional he owned, khakis and a button-down, trying to look like someone who belonged in police stations for reasons other than being arrested. The Metro Police Department occupied a concrete fortress downtown, all institutional beige and fluorescent lighting designed to make visitors feel small and powerless. David had been here once before, years ago, filing a report after someone broke into his truck and stole the radio. The experience had been educational in all the wrong ways, teaching him that police served certain communities and intimidated others, that the color of your skin determined whether officers saw you as citizen or suspect. Captain Thompson was waiting in a conference room on the 3rd floor, silver hair and square jaw, the kind of conventional attractiveness that probably photographed well at charity galas and press conferences. He stood when Elizabeth entered, expression shifting from professional courtesy to something harder, more personal. "Elizabeth, you didn't need to come. When you summon my employees for questioning about our professional relationship, yes, I absolutely needed to come." Elizabeth sat without being invited, gesturing for David to do the same. What exactly are you investigating, Ryan? Thompson remained standing, establishing dominance through height and position tactics David recognized from drill instructors and bullies who'd learned that physical intimidation was easier than actual authority. I received a complaint about potential fraud involving Anderson Technologies' Employee Assistance Program, specifically that Mr. Miller here obtained $150,000 in medical coverage through falsified documentation. The accusation hung in the air, absurd and dangerous in equal measure. David felt his pulse spike, adrenaline flooding his system the way it had in Kandahar when mortar fire started falling when you had seconds to decide between cover and courage. That's a lie. His voice came out steady despite the fear clawing at his throat. My daughter needs surgery. The company has legitimate emergency medical assistance for employees. I filled out the paperwork, provided documentation, went through proper channels. And you just happened to qualify for this assistance 2 days after being hired before your insurance even activated. Thompson pulled a folder from beneath his notepad, sliding it across the table. Seems convenient, almost like someone with authority over the program might have bent the rules for personal reasons. Elizabeth's laugh was sharp, humorless. This is pathetic even for you, Ryan. David's assistance was processed through HR, reviewed by our legal department, and approved by the benefits committee. There's a paper trail for everything, all above board, all following company policy. Then you won't mind if I review those documents. Verify everything is as legitimate as you claim. You have no jurisdiction over private corporate benefits programs. This is harassment, and we both know it. Elizabeth stood, gathering her purse, gesturing for David to follow. We're done here. If you want to continue this investigation, get a warrant. Otherwise, stay away from my employees and stay away from me. Thompson moved to block the door, and David saw calculation flash across his face, the weighing of how far he could push before crossing lines that even a police captain couldn't ignore. You always did have a thing for strays, Elizabeth. First that charity case from the East Side, now a mechanic with a sob story. When are you going to learn that you can't fix broken people by throwing money at them? The words were designed to wound, to expose vulnerabilities and create doubt, but Elizabeth didn't flinch, didn't give Thompson the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. David is worth 10 of you on your best day, and unlike you, he doesn't need to hide behind a badge to feel powerful. They left before Thompson could respond, Elizabeth moving through the police station with the controlled fury of someone who'd learned to weaponize composure. David followed, aware of eyes tracking their progress, aware that Thompson's accusations would spread through unofficial channels, regardless of their legitimacy, that he'd just become a target because Elizabeth Anderson had decided he was worth defending. The parking lot was gray concrete and failing light autumn dusk settling over the city like a shroud. Elizabeth stopped beside her SUV, hands shaking slightly as she searched for her keys, the first crack in the armor she'd maintained since they walked into that conference room. I'm sorry. Her voice was rough, stripped of the confidence that usually defined her. Ryan's been escalating for months, showing up at company events, calling my personal cell at odd hours, making it clear he's not ready to let go. I thought maybe if I ignored him, he'd eventually move on. I didn't think he'd go after you. David leaned against his truck, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand the larger game being played around him. Why does he hate you so much? Because I left. Because I chose my company over a relationship that was slowly strangling me. Elizabeth found her keys, gripped them tight enough that her knuckles went white. Ryan needs to control things, needs to be the center of every narrative. When I built Anderson Technologies, when I became someone who didn't need him, it destroyed his entire worldview. And now he's using me to hurt you. Yes. Elizabeth met his eyes, and David saw guilt there, genuine remorse for dragging him into battles he hadn't signed up for. I can reassign you if you want. Different department, different supervisor, enough distance that Ryan can't claim our professional relationship is anything inappropriate. The offer was genuine, accompanied by the understanding that accepting would be the smart choice, the safe choice, the decision that prioritized self-preservation over loyalty to someone he barely knew. David thought about Emma in that hospital bed next week, about the surgery that was only possible because Elizabeth had made it possible, about the job that had pulled them both from drowning. "I'm not going anywhere." The words came out with more certainty than David felt. "Captain Thompson doesn't get to intimidate me into quitting, and he definitely doesn't get to use my daughter's medical crisis as leverage in whatever twisted game he's playing." Elizabeth's expression shifted, relief and gratitude mixing with something else David couldn't quite identify. "Thank you. You don't know what that means." They stood in the parking lot as darkness gathered, two people bound together by circumstances neither had planned for, and David wondered how his life had become so complicated so quickly, how helping a stranger in a storm had led to this moment, this alliance against threats he barely understood. The next week crawled past with the special torture reserved for waiting rooms and countdown clocks. David worked, attended pre-surgical meetings, helped Emma prepare for an experience that terrified them both in different ways. Elizabeth kept her distance at the office, professional courtesy, replacing the tentative friendship that had been building, and David understood she was trying to protect him from Thompson's scrutiny, trying to minimize the ammunition her ex-fiancé could use against them both. Thursday night, the evening before Emma's surgery, Dorothy cooked a special dinner. All of Emma's favorite foods arranged on plates, like offerings to gods David didn't believe in but prayed to anyway when his daughter's life hung in the balance. Emma picked at her food, nervous energy making appetite impossible, and David didn't push, understood that fear had its own requirements. After dinner, Emma pulled out her sketchbook, the worn spiral-bound notebook she'd filled with hundreds of drawings over the past 3 years. She flipped through pages past portraits of Sarah and landscapes of places she'd never visited until she found a blank sheet. "Will you sit still for a minute, Daddy? I want to draw you." David settled into the chair across from her, trying to relax facial muscles that wanted to stay tense, trying to look like a father who believed his daughter would survive tomorrow instead of one who'd spent the past week imagining every possible way surgery could go wrong. Emma's pencil moved across paper with Sarah's same focused intensity, capturing something David couldn't see, translating emotion into graphite and shadow. When she finished, Emma turned the sketchbook around and David saw himself through his daughter's eyes, older than he felt, tired in ways that went beyond sleepless nights, but still there, still present, still fighting. In the background of the portrait, sketched lightly but unmistakably, was a woman who could only be Elizabeth, standing slightly apart, but clearly part of the scene, connected to their lives in ways Emma understood better than David had given her credit for. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." His voice caught emotion, overwhelming words. "When did you draw Miss Elizabeth?" "She's part of the story now." Emma said it simply, matter of fact, the way she stated all obvious truths. "Mom was part 1. You and me are part 2. Miss Elizabeth is part 3. David wanted to correct her, to explain that adults didn't appear in your life and automatically become family, that Elizabeth was his boss, his benefactor, someone who'd helped them but wasn't permanent, wasn't guaranteed. But looking at the drawing, at the way Emma had positioned the 3 figures like they belonged together, he couldn't find the words to dismantle his daughter's hope. "Get some rest." He kissed her forehead, tucking the blanket around her thin shoulders. "Big day tomorrow." "I'm scared." Emma's voice was small, muffled by pillows. "Me too, baby. Me too." David sat on the couch after Emma fell asleep, staring at his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found Elizabeth's number. His thumb hovered over the call button, indecision paralyzing him before he finally typed a text instead. "Surgery's tomorrow at 7 a.m. Just wanted you to know." The response came within seconds. "I'll be there." He wanted to tell her it wasn't necessary, that she'd done enough already, that showing up at the hospital would only fuel Thompson's paranoia and give him more ammunition. But the truth was, David didn't want to face tomorrow alone, didn't want to sit in that waiting room with only Dorothy's well-meaning platitudes for company, while strangers cut open his daughter's chest. Sleep was impossible. David lay in bed, watching ceiling shadows shift, listening to Emma's breathing through the thin apartment walls, counting down hours until dawn arrived, and transformed theoretical fears into immediate reality. At 5 a.m. he gave up on rest, made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and woke Emma with the gentle persistence of someone who knew delays wouldn't make this easier. Dorothy was waiting on her porch when they emerged, bundled against the October cold, clutching a thermos of tea and the kind of determination that suggested nothing short of natural disaster would keep her from that hospital. She hugged Emma carefully, mindful of the girl's fragility, whispering prayers David didn't believe in, but hoped might carry weight somewhere in whatever cosmic accounting decided who lived and who didn't. The drive to Children's Mercy Hospital took 20 minutes through empty streets, dawn painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that would have been beautiful if David could spare attention for anything beyond the road ahead. Emma sat in the back seat, holding Dorothy's hand quiet in a way that suggested she'd used up all her bravery reserves and was running on fumes now, on faith that adults knew what they were doing and wouldn't let her die. Elizabeth was waiting in the lobby when they arrived, coffee in hand, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of her usual corporate armor. She looked tired, like maybe she'd slept as poorly as David, but she smiled when Emma approached, crouching down to the girl's eye level. "Hey there, artist. Ready to get this fixed so you can go back to making beautiful things?" Emma nodded, not quite trusting her voice, and Elizabeth produced a small wrapped box from her bag. "I brought you something, for after surgery when you're feeling better." Emma unwrapped it carefully, revealing a professional-grade art set, colored pencils and charcoals and sketch paper that probably cost more than David's monthly grocery budget. Her eyes went wide, and for a moment the fear receded, replaced by wonder at holding tools she'd only ever admired through store windows. "This is too much," David started, but Elizabeth cut him off with a look. "It's a gift, from someone who believes Emma's going to have a long, healthy life to use them." The pre-surgical process was a blur of paperwork and consent forms and nurses who spoke in soothing tones while checking vitals and starting IVs. Emma changed into a hospital gown too big for her small frame, looking impossibly young and fragile under the fluorescent lights, and David felt his composure fracturing, felt the careful control he'd maintained start to slip. Dr. Kim appeared in scrubs, the surgical team assembled and ready, radiating the calm confidence of someone who'd done this procedure 100 times before. She explained the timeline, the steps, what David should expect during the 4-hour wait, while they opened Emma's chest and patched the hole that had been there since birth. "Any questions?" Dr. Kim's gaze moved between David and Emma, making sure they both understood what was about to happen. Emma's small voice cut through the clinical atmosphere. "Will it hurt?" "You'll be asleep, sweetie. You won't feel anything during surgery. After there will be some pain, but we'll give you medicine to help." Dr. Kim squeezed Emma's hand. "You're going to do great. I promise." The moment came when they had to take Emma back, when David had to let go and trust strangers with the only thing in the world that mattered. He hugged his daughter tight enough that she squeaked, whispering fiercely in her ear, "I love you more than anything, more than air, more than life. You fight through this, you hear me? You fight, and you come back." Emma's arms wrapped around his neck, small and strong and terrifying in their fragility. "I love you too, Daddy. Tell Mom I'll see her later, but not too soon." Then she was gone, wheeled through automatic doors that swung shut behind her, and David stood in that hallway feeling like someone had reached into his chest and torn out everything essential, leaving him hollow and barely functioning. Elizabeth's hand found his elbow, steadying him, guiding him toward the surgical waiting room, where other families sat in similar states of controlled panic, where time moved differently and 4 hours could feel like 40. Dorothy settled into a corner with her knitting rhythmic click of needles providing counterpoint to the waiting room's oppressive silence. Elizabeth sat beside David close enough that he could feel her warmth, far enough that hospital staff wouldn't read anything inappropriate into their proximity. They didn't speak, didn't need to, just existed in the shared space of vigil and hope, and the understanding that some experiences stripped away pretense until only raw humanity remained. An hour passed, then 2. David alternated between pacing and sitting, unable to settle, unable to focus on anything except the clock that seemed to move backwards. Elizabeth bought him coffee from the vending machine, terrible bitter brew that tasted like regret, and he drank it anyway because doing something felt better than doing nothing. At hour 3, a nurse appeared in the doorway, scanning the room until her eyes found David. His heart stopped, restart protocols failing because good news came at the end of surgery, not in the middle, and nurses appearing early meant complications, meant problems, meant the thing every parent feared most. "Mr. Miller, Dr. Kim wanted me to update you. Everything's going well. They've successfully patched the VSD and they're beginning the closing process now. Emma's vitals are strong and stable." The relief was physical, overwhelming, dropping David back into his chair like someone had cut the strings holding him upright. Dorothy's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down weathered cheeks, and Elizabeth's grip on his shoulder tightened, the only outward sign of the tension she'd been carrying. "Thank you." David's voice was hoarse, scraped raw. "Thank you." Another hour, and Dr. Kim emerged in person, still in surgical scrubs, mask pulled down to reveal a tired smile. "Emma did beautifully. The repair went exactly as planned, no complications. She's in recovery now, still sedated, but you can see her in about 20 minutes. David tried to stand legs, not quite cooperating, and Elizabeth helped him up her strength, compensating for his temporary weakness. They followed Dr. Kim through corridors that all looked identical, institutional wayfinding designed to disorient, until they reached the recovery area where Emma lay in a bed surrounded by monitors, chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity, looking impossibly small against white sheets and medical equipment. "She'll be groggy when she wakes up, probably in and out of consciousness for the next few hours." Dr. Kim checked the monitor reading, satisfied with whatever numbers displayed there. "The next 48 hours are critical for recovery, but I'm very optimistic about her prognosis. With proper care and follow-up, Emma should have a completely normal life expectancy." Normal. The word felt like a gift, like permission to imagine futures that extended beyond next week, beyond the constant crisis management that had defined David's existence since Sarah died. Emma could grow up, could have a normal life, could become the doctor she'd told Elizabeth she wanted to be. Dorothy excused herself to call friends from church to spread the good news and request continued prayers for recovery, leaving David alone with Elizabeth in the small recovery room. He sank into the chair beside Emma's bed, taking his daughter's small hand in his, careful of the IV lines and monitor wires, just needing the physical connection to prove she was real, was alive, was going to survive. "I don't know how to thank you." The words felt inadequate, couldn't possibly capture the magnitude of what Elizabeth had made possible. "For the surgery, for being here, for giving us a chance when we had nothing left." Elizabeth shook her head, settling into the other chair, eyes on Emma's sleeping face. "You don't owe me thanks, David. You saved my life that morning in the rain. This is just returning the favor." "That's not the same. I pulled you out of mud. You paid for my daughter's heart surgery. The currency doesn't matter. What matters is that we helped each other when help was needed." Elizabeth's voice was soft, contemplative. "I spent 5 years with Ryan, with someone who kept score of every favor, who treated relationships like transactions where someone always owed. I won't do that with you, with Emma. This isn't a debt. It's just what people should do for each other." They sat in comfortable silence as afternoon light filtered through the window, painting Emma's room in shades of gold and amber. David watched his daughter sleep, watched her chest rise and fall now under her own power instead of mechanical assistance, and felt something shift inside him, some fundamental recalibration of what was possible, what could be built from the ruins of what had been lost. Emma stirred around 3 o'clock, eyes fluttering open immediately. Finding David's face with the laser focus of a child, confirming her parent was still there, still protecting, still keeping watch. Her lips moved, forming words. Her throat couldn't quite produce, but David understood anyway. "You did great, sweetheart." He brushed hair back from her forehead, gentle touch that was all he could offer against the pain medication was already managing. "Surgery's done. Heart's fixed. You're going to be okay." Emma's gaze shifted to Elizabeth, recognition sparking despite the drugs clouding her awareness, and her hand moved slightly, reaching. Elizabeth took it without hesitation, and David watched his daughter squeeze weakly, watched her smile before drifting back to sleep. satisfied that the people who mattered were present and accounted for. In that moment, David realized Emma had been right in her sketch. Elizabeth was part 3 of their story, whether he'd planned for it or not, whether he understood what that meant or where it would lead. She'd become woven into the fabric of their lives, and trying to extract her now would tear holes that might never heal.